It's all good. As long as you keep it. That's all that matters. How you been doing? I'm good. I can good. Good. How you doing? All right. Let me see if I can find my card. That's my favorite drink, that Cali Supernatural. How you doing? How you doing? How you doing? I got a card right here. And a card right here. These people over that hall. That's a nice picture of y'all family. Oh, thank you. Yeah, that's a nice picture of y'all. Thank you so much. And I'm gonna be that guy to see now. Right there. Oh, you look so different with your glasses on. Did you? Yeah, you look different with your glasses on. I couldn't see you when you said hello. I was trying to see you. Yeah, you look different. I was at the kickoff. I was calling you around to get the sign. Oh, yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am. Everything. Yeah, that was nice. I'm ready to work. Yeah. They ready to have me to talk, and I said, when you gonna get the ground running? I wish I had some money to give us a bus. We'll take a dollar. I'm still praying. Hey, oh, I still might get something. And I'll come right over here up here. How much is gonna cost me, y'all, two of us? I'm speaking it already. Nice picture. Oh, sweet. I just got oh, okay. Okay. I really do that bad. Okay. I ain't good. No, I ain't good. Um, did you hear what happened? President Obama. Hi, how you doing? I mean, it's interesting because those kinds of relationships, conversations, knowledge, among people. across the U.S.
I don't think I'll be able to contain myself on this here. The slave life and.
Look, and you don't have to, sister. That's what we are for. This is the same space. This is the same space. Test.
No, I don't know. That's the name of my, that's how.
No. Testing. All right. All right. Well, thank you all for being here. We are back, bless you, back to the People's African History class here at Cafe Resistance. So glad to have you all here today. As always, make sure that you sign in if you're not getting the emails and the correspondence and the reminders for the class. We have a sign-in sheet over here, with flyers and information. Always, I like to always try to have something for you to take with you. So, just some documentation and some things here to take with you to share with any of your family, colleagues, friends, whoever, it's right there. So glad y'all back. I feel like it's been a while. Has it been a while? It seems like, but I think that we have typically 4 weeks, and that's what I realized. I thought it was last week, but we usually have 4 weeks in a month, but we had 5. So I think that's good.
That feels Sunday, yeah, that feels week.
That feels week, yeah, that's what that's really also.
It's a short month here, right?
Well, they give us the short, that's what they said, they give us the short. Black History Month. So, also you've been on streaming, right? I got a new camera. I've been trying to come up a little bit, so I got a new camera, so you should be able to see better on the streaming if you've been streaming the classes. So do that if you can't make it here in person. And then what's this month? Black History Month, right? That's right. Now for us, right, people who this ain't nothing new, right? This is something that we do all the time. We have this class. This class is not just on Black History Month. We do this all throughout the year because Black history cannot be relegated to just a month, right? And when you have people who've had, we go back to the beginning of time, you can't just relegate hundreds and thousands of years of history with just 1 month. So we celebrate it all the time, 365 Black, right? But for the rest of the world, for the rest of the people that may not be thinking on that level, this is the mainstream time in which Black history is celebrated, and we talk about Black history in this kind of mainstream way. So, but that's not going to stop us. However, because it is Black History Month, and this is the time where many people want to celebrate and bring notoriety to Black people and our history and our culture. On the next session, the third Saturday, we are going to have a special session. So we'll still have the class and the lecture and all of that, but we're going to do kind of like a special celebration. It's going to be a special thing that Ashley Institute is going to do for everybody who comes. So, just be prepared for that. And just try to do something different and celebrate our people, and celebrate our history. So that's what we're going to do. And we're going to talk about on that, the third Saturday, we're going to talk about the history of Negro History Week, right? So as you know, it started out as Negro History Week by Carter G. Woodson, talk a little bit about him, and then talk about how it has transformed in terms of going from Negro History Week to Black History Month, and then talk a little bit about that as well as some other things. So it's going to be a really good conference. Yes,
so the special edition on Saturday, third Saturday. Y'all gonna have barbecue? You gonna be grilling on the front porch?
You know what, man? I do have something planned. I don't know if I should institute that much money to make lamb chops and steak for all y'all. I know then it's gonna be 3 times as many people as it is now. Y'all know y'all like to do. Y'all know. But we are gonna have something nice. I don't know if we're gonna be grilling, but we're gonna have something nice. Maybe the Juneteenth. That'd be kind of cool. Do something like that for Juneteenth. We'll see. But yes, so that's what we have planned for Saturday. So make sure y'all come back. We have been talking about slave life in the U.S. So I think that was we talked about that last time. We didn't get to all of it. So we're going to finish this talking about the life of our ancestors and honoring our enslaved ancestors. And then after that, we're going to go into resistance. We're going to go into rebellions and all this other kind of stuff, emancipation and Reconstruction, and we'll continue with the African American story as well as talk about the Haitian Revolution. So we're going to have a specific one where we deal with the Haitian Revolution, because that is an important part of understanding how that really just became the impetus, right? That wasn't the first time that we revolted as people. We have been revolting in America since we landed. I think we talked about that on one of the lectures. We talked about how literally the moment we landed here, we was running away, we was fighting our way, 1619. So, but it was something special about the Haitian Revolution that definitely inspired Black folks and inspired us here in the U.S. and other places. The Haitian Revolution, that definitely inspired many of us to continue with our rebellions, our revolutions. Then Mark Vesey, who was another one we're going to talk about, the Nat Turner Rebellion that many people know was very much, and Harriet Tubman, very much inspired by the Haitian Revolution. So we'll talk a little bit about that. All right. Man, listen, and this was the first time that I had set up on time. I was like, going on time today. Yeah, let's go. Oh, right. Oh, there you go. Thank you. All right. So again, we're going to start out with the intro for those who may be new to the class. Just explaining what it's all about. The people means. The reason why we call this the People's African History class is when we talk about the people, it means it is for us, not us, by Black people, for Black people. And in this class, we want to learn from each other and all types of Black people. So a lot of times when we do things, and there's a lot of aspects of our community that the intention is for everybody, but sometimes it starts to get geared towards a certain group of people, maybe the educated class, or maybe the middle class, or maybe, certain groups of people. And with this class, what we want to do is this is for everybody. It doesn't matter where you're from, doesn't matter how much you know. You could only know Martin Luther King, or you could have read every book on Black history in the library, right? This is for you. Any questions you have, no question is a dumb question or a stupid question or anything. Any questions you have, we bring it here because we're here to learn from each other through discussion and sharing of knowledge. I always say there's plenty of things that you know that I don't know, plenty of things that I know that you don't know, and that we all know. I may say something and it may spark something that you may have heard or saw in a documentary or read. Feel free to bring it to us because this is a collective learning process. This is a collective learning space. The purpose of this knowledge is to uplift all of us as Black people, not just certain groups, not just people from certain regions, not just Black folks in the South, but Black folks in the North, or if we've got Caribbean ancestry. We try to represent across the diaspora. And so if you've been here, you've been coming here to these lectures and these classes, then you know that we talk about the African experience across the world, across the diaspora, not even just in the U.S. However, with this, where we are now in the class, we have been focusing a lot on U.S. history and Black American history, but we've been bringing in Caribbean history, we've been bringing in South American history, Brazil, everywhere. So this is about uplifting all of us as Black people. So again, raise your hand, join in the discussion. And again, we talk about Black history from Africa to the United States and all around the world. Okay? Again, don't forget to sign the sign-in sheet even when you come or when you leave, so that you'll know when the classes are and what we're doing and things we're doing here at Ashland Institute and even here at Campaign Resistance. So if you just want to be a part, and again, there's no pressure, because some people work, some people have families. So if you have things going on a Saturday, you just volunteer, come in whenever you can. No pressure. We talked about this, feel free to share your knowledge. And we talked about this. We're going to have a special 100 years of Black History celebration in our next session. So for those who may not have known, this is the 100th year of the celebration of Black history. Started out as Negro History Week. I think it was in '76 when it became Black History Month, if I'm not mistaken. Kent stated it in, I think, 70, and it became official president in '76. Right? So this is technically 100 years of Black history celebrations in a mainstream way. Obviously, we've been celebrating it for much longer. So make sure y'all come back for the third Saturday of the month. And I guess that's it. I guess we can go ahead and get to it. So all of this stuff we went over last time, we'll just do a quick review. But we basically brought us into the life of what it was like to be enslaved, to what it was like to be an enslaved African in the U.S. And so one of the things we did was we talked about the differences or comparisons between U.S. slavery versus older forms of slavery. And so we talked about how much of the older forms of slavery we saw in U.S. slavery. So the United States is not new to help to
this idea of slavery, indentured servitude, or even chattel slavery for that matter. But what the U.S. did was it systematized it. It created a whole system of punishment, an entire system of permanent inhumaneness, right, for Black people, for people. So the way in which it was done, it was spread, and it was done to a totally different level than what it had been in older forms of slavery. But there were older forms of slavery in other parts of the world that were horrific. There were beatings, there was sexual assault. But again, U.S. slavery took that and expanded it to a much larger scale. Okay? We talked about some of the ironies of freedom, the fact that the Statue of Freedom on the Capitol is a Native American woman. Thomas Jefferson recommended a Black man to live in Washington, D.C., even though he himself claimed to have loved a Black woman and then enslaved this woman that he claimed to have been in love with. What to enslave is the 4th of July is a major hypocritical statement, right? That Frederick Douglass put forth that says, you know, you expect us to celebrate your 4th of July, but what does that mean to us? That is not a day of freedom for us. It continues to be a day of bondage. We talked a little bit about certain aspects of what it was like to be an enslaved person. Had images of what a slave house looked like, an image of an actual enslaved person being captured, either coming, being brought to the coast, or maybe even trying to run away and then being captured and brought back. One of the things we talked about, and I think it's very important, when we talk about slavery in the Americas, is we couch it under the notion of capitalism, right? Slavery under capitalism is a very important way in which we have to frame this, because racism was not the impetus for slavery. It wasn't that. In fact, racism became the effect of slavery. But it wasn't just this overall hatred that Europeans had for Africans. That didn't start. That was the effect of slavery and the effect of racism. And so I think that's very important. And a lot of people may not know that it was really just greed. It was capitalism. It was that this group is the best group for the for the goal in which we're trying to achieve, right? And so initially, prior to African people being enslaved, does anybody know which group they enslaved first here in the Americas?
Well, they tried the Indians.
They tried Native Americans, right? They tried the Native Americans, but does anybody know what happened? Why they were not as successful in enslaving Native Americans here in the continent?
Various books say that various books say the indigenous people were cut out for the work that the white man had for them. One. Others say, well, you know, the indigenous people could escape back to various home communities, so it was harder to enslave them. So white people said, well, okay, get the African people who would stick out more, would be foreign to this space, and therefore couldn't run or hide anything slavery and be noted based on skin color and appearance.
Yeah, absolutely. So much of that was because many Native Americans, because they had been here hundreds of thousands of years before the Europeans got here, they knew the land. They knew the land way better, so it was very difficult for them to be able to enslave somebody in a land that they own, in a home that they built their culture, they built their civilization on, right? Imagine if somebody were to try to capture you in your own house, right? You know where to hide, you know where the guns are, you know where the knives are, you know where the weapons are, you know where everything is, and so that would be difficult for them to do in your own home. So that was one of the reasons why it was very difficult to enslave Native Americans. And then they also tried a type of indentured servitude enslavement process on Europeans as well, but that was also not not successful.
I have a comment. My voice loud.
Oh, yeah, go ahead.
So I'm not sure whether my comment, in some ways might be a small pushback on something you say, but if it is, it's not disrespectful at all. Okay. So I'm not sure that, from my standpoint, that the enslavement of African people was not also based on race and racism. Let me say why. So there's a book that's called White Trash. It talks about how the British white people wanted to take white people who were poor in Britain and send them to this new colony like they would do 200 years later in Australia. And they thought of white people who were the residents of Europe who were poor, just send them because that's the only thing to do with a poor Britain was just to make them servants. They tried that, but then they eventually figured that the Britons were still considered a human being in England, so they would have a lot of problems with that. And so when 1619 rolled around, these Dutch and British ships hijacked Portuguese vessels taking Africans to Mexico, they eventually figured that we're going to capture Africans, and that's what they did, and that's how they hijacked in Mexico, Portuguese vessels at first. But then, quickly, they figured from their Bible that African people were to be hewers of wood and drawers for white people of the Caucasian race. And they determined that Africans would manifest disposition. And so coming back to this issue about the Indians or that white people considered the Indians that was here and the indigenous people in Central America and South America, they said they did not have anything in their Bibles exactly to make them at the level of the African, which was a dirty, naked savage that God despised. And so they figured that, and this was coming from various professors, saying that, okay, so where was the position of these native peoples and Central American people? They said that, well, okay, so these people are inferior to the white man, but if there's a native person and they marry or intermingle with Europeans or just in general, the native person could achieve the level of the poorest European. And that's how they put them. But an African person was already, from their Bibles, designed to be a hew of wood and draw of water for white people, as Arabs had said earlier, 1,000 years before, in the Arab slave trade that preceded the European. So I don't know if I agree that it wasn't based on race. I think it was based on a combination of things: ideological, white supremacy, greed, capitalism, and all those things combined. But maybe I'm wrong.
That's all you had, and then I'll address that.
You were talking about indigenous people, Native Americans being slaves. My first thought was, once the Europeans started doing that, all the various Native American tribes would be going, oh, hell no. And they'd be, and the plantation people would be under attack so much they'd have to give that up. I don't know if any of that happened.
Right. So like when they from the Native Americans.
When they tried to enslave Native Americans.
Right, so there was always pushback for sure from Native American tribes as well. I don't know if there were large scale, I never heard of large scale rebellions, like the way in which I've heard from black folks, Moses, Black Moses obviously had it something to others, but yes, Native Americans absolutely did. Like, but it was very difficult for them to even enslave into the way in which it was done to African people, right, because of the fact that Native Americans leave the land. And so it didn't even last that long. And in response to 400 years, white trash, I think it's called White Trash, the 400 Years of Untold Slavery. Yeah, so yeah, I read that text as well. And in addition to that text, I think it was a text by the name of George Frederickson, A Short History of Race, where he talks about, and I think that text, again, talks about 400 years. So that goes back to roughly about the 1500s. But George Frederickson's work goes back to about 1096, 1012 maybe. And it was in that piece where he talks about how religion was actually kind of the impetus for this whole notion of a larger slave trade, simultaneously happening with the Arab slave trade, and saying that this idea that there was just this complete racist idea that initiated this slave trade from Europe into Africa could be argued largely because Europeans actually deified and actually studied from Africans, and we learned about that when we did the European lecture. And we talked about how many Europeans saw African people as gods and saw them as leaders and saw them as educators because they had the oldest civilization in the world, which was the what? What civilization was that? The Egyptian, Kemetic civilization, we talked about that. And so they knew all these things. And so because of that, there had to be this idea that, well, it's not that all Black people or all African people are these subjugated people. Many of these ideas that were discussed in terms of biblically, why African people could not be any more than Europeans in terms of humanity, much of this came after, so around the 1600s, much of this came after much of this trade had already started. And so these were ways in which it was done and created, these philosophies were done to justify this idea that was initiated very much off of capitalism. Now, it does not mean that there was not prejudice. And just like you said, brother, even in the Arab slave trade, there is evidence that says many of the people who initiated and many of the people who participated in the Arab slave trade enslaved both African and European people. However, the African people were often given the most menial jobs. So it wasn't that it did not exist, very similar to what the brother said. Maybe the extent to which it exists wasn't as bad as it is now, but this combination of prejudice, racism, capitalism, definitely. But when we take it back all the way back to the early 10, 11, 1200s, we see that there is very much a lot of evidence that shows that Europeans deified and looked to African people as these kind of leaders because they had the oldest civilization in the world. So that's a really good point. I want to go ahead and finish this review before we get started on this new material. Come on in, y'all get some. Yeah, come on, you want to get some? Yeah. We talked a little bit about the cotton gin, cotton as king of the South. We talked about how the cotton gin was very big on helping to essentially industrialize slavery. And with the cotton gin, allowing for the picking as well as the production and manufacturing of cotton to intensify, that made slave labor even more important and even more beneficial to the South as well as to the North. So this is just a quick image of some enslaved people picking cotton, a Black child picking cotton here. And I think this is where we ended, if I'm not mistaken, was particularly women's experiences in slavery, right? So we talked about how it's important for us to understand that slavery affected both African men and women, but women's experiences were very unique when it came to slavery, particularly because women's bodies were seen as not only, they were seen as laborers, but also the reproducers of labor. So because they actually birthed, right? And they were seen as being the medium for birthing this capital that was needed to build this U.S. economy on. They were looked at and treated and dehumanized in a different way. Very much so, especially when we talk about sexually. Now, somebody did bring up the last time that black men were sexually objectified as well, not just from white women, but from white men, right? There's not as much research that I found on the dehumanization sexually of African men, but there is research on the buck breaking, right, that would occur in the Caribbean and things of that nature. But we know that there was black women and African women constantly had to run away or were afraid of being raped, being sexually assaulted on the plantations, on and off the plantations, from the slave ship all the way here. We talked a little bit about how Sojourner Truth, in her speech, Ain't I a Woman, talks about how she does just as much work as a man. She picks just as much cotton, she works just as hard, and ain't I a woman? Am I not a woman like the white woman is, right? Why do I not get treated the same as a black man or as a white woman? And so this piece kind of brings out, right, it kind of becomes the forerunner or the foundation for intersectionality and black feminism. Black feminist thought that we now study in academia today. So we talked a little bit about that. We talked about how the black woman essentially was the birther of the nation, because literally black women were called upon to breastfeed white children, breastfeed the white child that was born on the plantation. Because many white women felt as though breastfeeding was this antiquated idea, it was uncivilized, right? And so black women were called upon, and the African women, the enslaved African women, was called to breastfeed the white child. Now we understand what? What do we understand now about breastfeeding? It's actually healthy, right? It's one of the healthier ways in which you can provide the nutrients needed for your child, right? And so many women now breastfeed as long as they possibly can to give their child the nutrients and boost their immune system. So I think that was where we ended last time. And so in 1808, the international slave trade ended, causing an increase in the domestic slave trade. So that was one of the things that I think is also very important for us to talk about. Let me pull up these notes real quick. All right, yeah. So one of the things that's very important is this increase in breeding, and there was an increase in the price of enslaved people. So from $1,800 in 1850, it started to increase, and women again became essentially the machines for the creation of U.S. wealth. Because in the early part of the 19th century, as other countries across the world started to see the slave trade as being something that was inhumane, morally wrong, spiritually wrong, you had Great Britain and you had other European countries that were starting to end the slave trade. The U.S. kind of went on board with that as well. And also there was a change as the world is becoming more industrialized. Other countries started to see that maybe there wasn't as strong of a need for slavery as well. So it wasn't just because people started to become smarter or people became more righteous. That wasn't necessarily the reason. A lot of it was economic as well. I think that's important for us to talk about. But as the slave trade started to end in other parts of the world, the U.S. came on board, and so in the early part of the 19th century, they made the slave trade illegal, but they did not make slavery illegal. So it was illegal to bring African people from the continent to the Americas, but the ones that were already here, they was SOL, right? And also it did not necessarily stop the slave trade process, because what would end up happening is they would just smuggle them in, right? They would just smuggle African people in, just like you smuggle in drugs, or during the Prohibition era, they would smuggle in liquor. So they did that well up until very, very close to the Civil War.
Question, back at that time, was it not the thought process from a Congress that didn't really have a stiff spine? I don't know if we've ever had that in history, but they said, well, we'll ban the importation of slaves. And they figure, well, okay, that will burn out slavery in the country because they can't bring them in anymore. And then they were outsmarted by starting the breeding process.
That's a good point. That's a good point, yes.
I have a question. Okay, so I want to ask you, do you agree or maybe not agree with the lady who did the 1619 project, Hannah Jones? She says that that the so-called colonists, these 13 states, 13 colonies, that the people want to claim now that the reason that they wanted to break from Britain was because of offensive and oppressive taxes from Britain that these colonists had to pay. She said that that was not true, that basically they wanted to get from underneath Britain's hammer because these were like middle-income white people who ran this government and poor white people, and they thought that if Britain decided to drop the hammer on cutting off the actual slave trade, that these colonists would be basically stuck up underneath the British Empire. And they thought that if they had enough African slaves and they could just break free and go for themselves, they would have enough leverage to make it on their own. So it was really trying to break from Britain so they could maintain slavery and have an independent colony, where these other places, whether it be Canada, Australia, places like that, they just had to stay up under the British Empire because they couldn't go for themselves. They didn't have an economic way to move. Do you agree with her, or do you just diet that?
I mean, I've heard that before, and I had never thought about it from that perspective because even when I was a history teacher on the middle school, elementary middle school level, that's what I was always taught, and that's what I always read. So I always said the same thing. They broke away because of no taxation and representation. But not until that thesis was proposed, it makes sense time-wise, right? When you look at the time frame in which the revolution happened, this is happening around the time that European countries are starting to ban the slave trade. But then, I don't know, because right at the beginning of the 19th century, the United States did the exact same thing. So I don't think it's a far-off assumption. I don't think it's a far-off assumption. I don't know if we have enough evidence to say that that is the reason, but just like what you said earlier, it could have been a combination of things that made America say maybe we can't branch off on our own. Not to mention, the U.S. was also not only trading with Great Britain, but they were also making a lot of money with France and Germany and Spain as well. So breaking off with them just breaking off one of their trading partners didn't necessarily mean, or coming from under their rule, didn't necessarily mean they wouldn't trade with them either, and they were also getting money from France, Germany, and Spain. So I think it could have been done. But yeah, I've heard that before as well. Let me see. Oh, so some of the ways in which Black women, again, were seen as these machines for the creation of wealth. One was arranged marriages, right? We talked about that last time. This idea of putting the biggest Black man or enslaved Black man with the biggest enslaved woman to make this enslaved child. And some people have said that's the reason why Black people run the NBA and run the NFL now. We talked about that last time. The groups of enslaved women that white men allowed for their friends to have access to. So there was definitely this, when so-called slave masters would have their friends over, and essentially they would parade these African women around them and allow them to choose which one they wanted to rape, essentially, right? So these were other ways in which Black women, and talking about the women's experience in slavery, were these machines for the creation of wealth. Obviously, we also talked about how policy showed that any child that was born, African child that was born, had to take on the status of the, which one, mother or father?
Mother.
The mother. And why did they pass that policy to say that the child had to take the status of the mother? Because the father could be a free white man, right? He could be an enslaved black man or a free white man, but it doesn't matter. And that allowed for white men to have access to black women's bodies without necessarily losing the capital that they would gain from it, right? In fact, it would allow them to make more money, so-called, for free, right? So again, the banning of slavery existed, but because there was a banning of slavery, now there was a value on African women who were fertile. Yes, sir.
Just to your point, I was raised in Ghana like 2 years ago.
Okay.
The door of no return. And our tour guide was telling us just about kind of like what you're talking about, how they had this little small room, probably on no side, no bigger than this table right here, where they kept women who refused to be raped before they got shipped off, right? And so so once they decided once they decided to the terms, they got pregnant, treat them real nice. And then once they had the child, they'll keep the children and then they'll ship the parents off to wherever, whatever country they were shipped them off to. So, just to your point, the black women, the black slave woman, like we have no idea the magnitude of what she's going through.
Oh, absolutely.
It is not typically highlighted.
Absolutely. I didn't even know that there was another room in the door of no return strictly for that purpose. And oftentimes they would put the woman, the mother, on one ship, and then they would put the child on another ship.
And the father on
another ship to keep that family separated. Why? Why do they do that? To keep them alive. To keep them alive. It was intentional, right? Because they understood what about the African family? How powerful and how strong, and that was the very foundation, right? How that was the very foundation of civilizations. Whether it's big as Ghana, Mali, and Songhai, or smaller civilizations, how important the African family and the black family was. Women were punished if they couldn't produce enough children. And then all of this even goes down into these stereotypes that we see of black women today. If you've ever read Black Feminist Thought by Patricia Hill Collins, in 1990, she talks about the various stereotypes that we see not only in discussions, but also in media around black women. Nanny and Jezebel stereotypes, these stereotypes started from African women who were enslaved, right? So very important. As always, for me, I think it's extremely important not just to talk about what we've been through in terms of being enslaved African people and the life of enslaved people, but also how we resisted, how we rebelled, that the strength that we have to continue to protest, to continue to fight. This is a part of who we are. And this part of the story, we got plenty of movies, plenty of documentaries on black people being so-called slaves and being oppressed and marching for freedom and all the, civil rights and all that. But we don't have enough material that shows how we fought back and when we fought back and the creative ways in which we had to continue to use to fight for justice and to fight against our oppressors. And so generally, enslaved people resisted in two ways. They ran away or they resorted to day-to-day resistance. And some of the things that enslaved African people would do is they would sabotage the crops, right? So they would sabotage the crops, they would poison food, right? They would destroy machinery and act like, it just broke, it just failed. That's whatever, I'm sorry, right? They would say slowdowns. So just in the same way that in the civil rights movement, I think even today, the school that I graduated from, Paxson, they staged a walkout, the students did, in support of of those people who had been assaulted by ICE. And so they did a whole walkout at the school that I graduated from here in Jacksonville. That same thing, that is just a part of the tradition of slowdowns that African people would do. They would all come together and say, hey, we're gonna work slower today. We're not gonna produce as much today. He may whoop one of us, but he ain't gonna whoop all of us, right? So there was this unity that enslaved African people had on the plantation. They were burned plantations, right? There's many examples. If you look deep enough, there's some evidence of Black folks burning entire plantations down, right? Especially when they were revolting. So Denmark Vesey and Nat Turner, as they would go from plantation to plantation and recruit people, they would burn each plantation down and cause these white folks to lose massive amounts of money. They conducted insurrections, as we talked about. Free Black people supplemented the slave resistance by creating militant journalism on the evils of slavery, right? So we're going to talk about the North Star. That was a newspaper, magazine, the Liberator. That was another one to spread the information and spread information about abolitionism and spread information about freedom and the spirit of getting rid of this system of slavery. So folks that ran up north to Philadelphia and other places usually went to the Pen, right? And the Pen, newspaper, magazines, that was like our TV now, right? That was like our social media now. That wasn't just a small thing. When we created these newspapers and these magazines, that was the key way in which information got out. So that was very important. And does anybody know the story of Moses Dixon? Anybody ever heard of Moses Dixon? I just found out about the story. I thought it was so interesting. It's the story of a man by the name of Moses Dixon. I believe he was enslaved as a child, and then he got free, and he began to read up, and he understood, and he became so angered at the system of slavery that when he became of age, he decided he wanted to do something about it. And so what he did was he started this insurrection. But this insurrection essentially was prepared for about 10 years. He started it in 1846, and he was recruiting enslaved people from plantations all over. And he would go to these various plantations, and he would recruit people for his eventual revolt. And what they would do is they would work during the day, and at night they would train in the fields. They would do military training in the fields, learning how to fight, learning how to be soldiers, learning how and they did this for an entire 10 years in a group. They say it grew to about 40,000 enslaved people that were preparing for this militant uprising, right? And so I said that started in 1846. It was around 1856, right when he was getting ready to attack. He had gotten word about the Civil War, right? That there was war brewing, and that this war could possibly end slavery. And so right before he was getting ready to initiate this uprising and wreak havoc on the South with these thousands and thousands of enslaved people, he canceled it. He canceled the uprising and said, you know what, I think if we hold off, we would save a lot of our lives, and if we allow this war to plan out, this could actually be the end of slavery. And so he then became a soldier in the Union Army, and then from there, he took his money, his cachet, his influence, and he started an HBCU, Lincoln University, not the one in Pennsylvania. I forgot what state. There's another Lincoln University. Missouri, that's one, yes, in Missouri. Started Lincoln University in Missouri. So, interesting story. But again, part of the tradition of resistance. And so, for the rest of this time, most of what we're going to talk about is the resistance that Black people pushed for to rebel against this heinous system that we live under. Just a question. Somebody else?
No, so you said live as it
used to. And continue, exactly, and continue to live under. Absolutely. Absolutely. So this is just an example of a reward bulletin, right? So for a runaway enslaved person, they would get $150 if they returned an enslaved person. This was one in 1838, September of 1838. So that was another way in which many of us resisted. We would just put down the machinery and just start running, right? I think this was very important. This slide actually was inspired by my aunt. My aunt was the person, I think, when I was very, very young. She kind of inspired me to appreciate and love and have an appreciation for Black history. And she was educated, born here and educated in California, I believe during the whole Black Power movement era. And so she learned a lot and brought it back here to Florida and taught me a lot of things. And one time we were having a conversation and she had done history on our family and the history of slavery in our family. And she talked about how our great something grandfather, the slave master that he had, she said he was a nice slave master, he was a kind slave master, and he gave our family member their 40 acres and a mule after the Civil War because he was kind. And I said, Auntie, there's no such thing as a kind slave master, right? He number one, he gave him what he owed. Actually, he was owed more than that, right? But he did what he was supposed to do. So that's number one. And number two, the fact that he was enslaved in the first place makes this man unkind. So there's no such thing as a kind slave master, right? And she was like, you know what, nephew, you are making it. And so I just want to kind of talk about that in a second. Go ahead.
So did your family grow up on this 40 acres? Or did they take that and make it 80 acres or what happened?
So my family, they still have some of the acres today, but because they didn't have the money, but many of them didn't have the resources or the education to maintain it, I think they only have like 10 acres of it left because much of it has been taken by the government, right? Couldn't keep up the payments and the taxes and that kind of thing. So those things also happened to many of the African people that did get their 40 acres, that it ended up getting taken away, right, in other ways. Use of corporal punishment was a very common practice, right, for so-called slave masters. It was very rare that an African person would reach old age without receiving at least one lashing. So even those slave masters that were seen as being so-called kind, many of them still use, even if they didn't do it as much as others, still use whippings and lashings and branding to keep these so-called slaves in check. And no matter how cooperative or uncooperative the African was, it was very unlikely for any African person who was enslaved to not have received at least one whooping in their life, right? One thing I wanted to talk about was the abolition movement. So again, talking about resistance and talking about ways in which we essentially fought back. So the abolition movement was a movement that was an amalgamation and integration of both Black and white social leaders, political leaders, religious leaders, right? Folks like William Lloyd Garrison, Harriet Tubman, William Rose Brown, and many others were people that were involved in creating and establishing and advancing this abolitionist movement. The eagerness of Black abolitionists to join the movement for liberation was demonstrated by their reaction to the appearance of things like the Liberator. And again, we talked about the Liberator. It was an abolitionist newspaper. I believe that one was started by William Lloyd Garrison. And they had about 450 subscribers in the first year, and about 400 of those subscribers were African people. Affluent Black abolitionists would send Garrison, William Lloyd Garrison, a gift of $50. People would support this abolition movement with their dollars. They would support it in many different ways. Historians like to ascribe abolitionism to the liberal, more progressive white Northerners. However, it was Black abolitionists that grew the movement. So it is important that, yes, there were these liberal white Northerners who helped to start the abolition movement and definitely provided some support but a majority of the people who were involved in the abolitionist movement were Black people. And it was them that helped to grow the movement, especially free Black Northerners, because many of them also had the education, right? They had the education, they had the resources, they had the connections to the South. And then, of course, the more upper class Black folks in the North, as well as in New Orleans, Louisiana, that helped to grow this movement. The second wave, so the second wave of the abolition movement was religion, or was religion based. So this abolitionist movement, after the one that we're most familiar with, is the second wave. But there was a first wave that happened in, I believe it was in the 1700s, and then the latter part of the 1700s, and then it was the second wave that occurred, and that's where you get stories about Harriet Tubman. That's where you get Nat Turner. That's where you get a lot of the stories that we know today during the second wave. Yes.
Would Moses Dixon be considered an evolutionist?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. Moses Dixon for sure. And again, he was part of the second wave as well. The difference with the second wave of the abolitionist movement was that, again, it was very much religious. And it was brought on and inspired by a larger religious movement. For those who may know about U.S. history, I think it was the Second Great Awakening, if I'm not mistaken. I think it was called the Second Great Awakening. And it was where a lot of the Protestant churches that we know of today, it was started during that Second Great Awakening of the middle part of the 1800s. So a lot of the churches that we know, a lot of churches that we're familiar with, it was even during this time that some churches were preaching that Jesus was going to come back. And so many people sold much of their materials, their houses, their land. Some of them even freed African people or sold them off to get the money because they said, hey, Jesus is coming back and we're all going to go to heaven. So there were some religious groups that were on fire from this movement that was happening. And it was this larger Second Great Awakening that was happening that also inspired, coupled with the quest for freedom, that caused a lot of Black people during this abolition movement to merge this religion with wanting to be free. And again, this is why you have folks like Harriet Tubman, who said she was inspired by God. And God told her that it was her mission to start and initiate this Underground Railroad and free her people. And that it was, Nat Turner said the exact same thing, that his inspiration came from God as well. I believe that Mark Vesey and many others said that it was religion and it was God that inspired him, and a lot of that came from this movement. Yes, sir.
Are you underneath the idea that a lot of these white northern abolitionists, would you be underneath the idea that they also believe that once abolition of slavery would take place, that what should be done is that the African people should be sent somewhere else as a colonization, and that many of these same northern abolitionists were also part of the American colonization society?
Absolutely, yeah. So, and that is one of the early forms of repatriation, right? Traditional repatriation and Black folks going back to Africa. I don't know if I was saying it started it, but that was an important part of the American Colonization Society, where many people believe, hey, we need to either free or let these African people go, and when we do, take them back to particularly Liberia, right? And after that was created for free Black people in America, right? So that was part of this whole process. Many abolitionists believe that once we free these people, they need to be taken back to the African continent. And so there was that connection between the abolitionists, and of course, many Black people as well. I believe people like Martin Delaney were getting ready to talk about, with many others, who believe that not only should we be free on this continent, but once we're free here in America, many of us should return back to Africa.
Lincoln was one of the biggest components of that.
Absolutely.
Just even an hour, literally an hour before he signed the Emancipation Proclamation, he was trying to make as many deals as he could to find a way to get black people out of here. Islands on the coast of Haiti.
Yes.
Thought about Texas, Tanzania, and then Liberia.
Yes.
We just was fed up after the Emancipation Proclamation took place that the black leaders didn't go for the repatriation.
Right.
He was furious about that. He said that he didn't feel like he had the stomach to make black people leave. So he thought they should because they fought in this Civil War. And he said that white people who had fought their brothers and sisters just didn't have the stomach to force the black people to leave.
Yeah.
That's what he thought. But he somehow portrayed as someone who thought that black people should just be free, but he outlined that black people were an inferior race.
Yeah.
And he didn't believe in the enslavement of black people. But before he became president, as a barrister, he believed states like Ohio should be states that were non-slave states for young white people to be, so they would not be in competition with free African labor. I don't know. For some reason, we've been getting a false impression of Lincoln news. I don't know why, but a lot of lies in the throws.
Yeah. Especially about Lincoln, yes.
No, just his point, it was just that, we always hear about slavery and racism in the South. Right. You know what I mean? But it was all over, and that's what I just, to your point, just because the North was fighting and freeing slavery, like there was still racism and slavery in the North.
Yeah.
And so, we don't really, like I said, we really talk about slavery in the South and how bad it was horrible. And we make the North as if it was like this knight in shining armor, but there was still racism in the North.
Sure. Absolutely. Oh, absolutely. Yeah. You right there.
And it still is.
Yeah, it still is. I mean, even up to the Civil Rights Movement, Martin Luther King went on record saying some of the worst racism that he ever experienced was in Chicago. It was in Chicago, right? Worse than Birmingham, right? So, and it goes back to one of our previous slides where there's a famous quote by Malcolm X where he says, everywhere below Canada is the South. Is the South. So he said that to say, because many black people felt like what you were saying. Well, if we go to New York, if we go to Chicago, if we go to, St. Louis, it's going to be better. And Malcolm was saying, no, it's bad all over. It may look different in different places, but it's bad everywhere we go, right?
Come forward and join the Seminoles. Say come forward and join the Seminoles.
Right. The Native American connection with the black folks, definitely fighting until they became a colony, a Spanish colony. But yeah, absolutely. And yes, of course, the Haitian Revolution was a part of the movement of resistance that we're going to talk about later as well. This is just a quick image of Harriet Tubman and her husband. I don't know who this other person is. Kind of jumped in the picture, but this is just a picture, again, talking about the abolition movement and the fight to free our people. This is just a quick map, 1854, so you can see the number of free states that existed, the number of slave states that existed, and then there were these many of these territories, Kansas and many others, that were fighting between being slave and being free territories, and so you had these states here as well. And I thought this was a good map to show, just to kind of give you a visual and an image of what, from a geographical standpoint, what slavery and what freedom looked like. Again, 1854, shortly before the Civil War, right? I think it's very important, again, when we're talking about this second great awakening, right? We're talking about the second abolition movement that's occurring in the middle part of the 1800s, that the significance of the Black church and how the Black church plays such a key role in advancing the abolition movement, and how the Black church played a key role in being a space for African people to stage rebellions, to stage revolutions, to organize, to find humanity, right? It was that place where a Black man and a Black woman could be called Mr. and Mrs., where the preacher was seen as a leader, as opposed to when he was seen on the cotton fields as not human, right? So, and one of the very significant religious organizations that came out of this Great Awakening was the A&E Church and the growing of the Black church as a whole. So an independent Baptist church took root among free African Americans in the early 1800s in response to the discrimination that they had gone through. And if you read books by Sierra Lincoln is a professor who has written several texts on Black folks' liberation and religion. Black folks' liberation and religion. He wrote a very big piece on the Black Muslims in America. And that book, Malcolm X talks about that text, and that was another book that made Sierra Lincoln very popular. But he's written many books on Black folks and religion. And Sierra Lincoln and Lawrence White, in their chronicle of the Black church and the African American experience, observed that among so-called free Black people, mutual aid societies and churches were among the first institutions created by Black people. In the 1840s, white Baptists split over the issue of slavery, and so-called slave masters used religion to suppress African culture and to instill submissiveness through religion. But once Black folks began to Africanize religion or inject their own culture and their own beliefs and their own ideas, religion soon became a vehicle for resistance. And so it was after that you started to see folks like Denmark Vesey and others who began to use religion as a form of resistance. So the Free African Society was founded by Richard Allen, Axel Jones in Philadelphia, and they created this constitution. And this constitution became the precursor for the African Methodist Church, which was the first official Black church. Some argue it was the first official Black church in the United States. By the 1820s, it was the leading organization among Methodists, and then Richard Allen, who was the leader of the African Methodist Episcopal Church, eventually launched a Black convention in 1830, the same year that Nat Turner initiated his rebellion, and he galvanized these Black clergy, these laymen, and this began to intensify and help grow the Black church, the Black A&E church. In the 1840s, again, we talked about how Baptists were split over the issue, and so they started to go their separate ways, white folks, and then they started to get Black folks, enslaved Africans, to say, hey, now we can actually worship in the way that we want to worship, right? Because they couldn't when they were integrated with white folks. They couldn't do the things that we do in Black church now, call and response, playing the drums, shouting, dancing. All of those things were not allowed when they integrated with the white church. But once we begin to separate, we begin to allow ourselves to be ourselves, and we use much of this cultural content to say, okay, now we can read the Bible for ourselves. Now we can read the word for ourselves. And before, they would only allow us to read certain parts of the Bible. What parts of the Bible were we allowed to read only when we were integrated with the white church?
About going to heaven.
Parts justify slavery, would you say?
Going to heaven.
Yeah, you don't worry about now. Don't worry about being free now. Just wait, and you're gonna be free in heaven. So deal with it now. And then Black folks, when we separate, we say, well, how come the white man get to have his heaven on earth and in heaven? And we gotta wait for ours. We don't want to wait for ours too, right? study for ourselves and realize a lot of these things were taken out of context. A lot of what was said in the Bible, it was preached. The book on Philemon was preached, slaves obey your masters, but they skipped over that whole book of Exodus, right? Where these people who were enslaved, now because of this Moses figure, was now free. Oh, they didn't read that story. They didn't tell us this story. So we started to read the word for ourselves, and we started to become inspired. And so aftermath of the revolts of Denmark, basically Nat Turner, Black religious activity was ruthlessly suppressed by slave owners, and Black spirituals became a code for sending messages from plantation to plantation. So it was during this time that we started to use songs and spirituals to help sing code that Harriet Tubman was coming, that a revolution was starting, that there was a resistance that was on the horizon. And so we began to use religion in that way. And so I think it's very important for us to talk about, to critique the Black church, because there's a lot of criticism that we have on the Black church, but also it was through Black religious institutions that helped us have the advances that we have today. Henry McNeil Turner was a very important figure when we're talking about abolitionism and when we're talking about resistance. He was born in what is now Hannah Circuit near Newberry. He possessed an insatiable craving for knowledge, and he joined the Methodist Episcopal Church South in 1848 and he was licensed to preach in 1853. He was bound out to the hardest king of labor in the cotton fields and the blacksmith trade. He learned the blacksmith trade until he became a man at what they call the age of 12. His mother hired a white lady to give him lessons every Sabbath to teach him how to read. But the neighbors eventually told on her, and so they threatened her life if she continued to have this white woman teach her son how to read. And so again, that was against the law at that time. He eventually became the first Negro chaplain in the United States Army, and it was Henry McNeil Turner. He came on board as saying, "I am here to demand my rights and to hurl thunderbolts at the man who would dare to cross the threshold of my family." And Henry McNeil Turner, one of the early religious leaders in the African Methodist Episcopal Church, was also one of the foremost leaders of what we would call the self-determination movement in Black history, right? So you have different folks. You have folks like Frederick Douglass and W.E.B. Du Bois and others who wanted to work within the system, right? And that kind of leads us into the tradition of Martin Luther King and others who wanted to work within the system. But then there's the self-determination part of our history and of resistance, where folks were saying, like what the good brother's saying, we should go back to Africa. We should completely separate from the white man. We should have our own institutions. We don't have to depend on the white man for anything. And so Henry McNeil Turner was a part of that religion and that tradition of people who were very frustrated with oppression and were even willing to use violence, right? That is another separation of resistance. There were some of our leaders who believed that nonviolence was the only way, and then there were some of our leaders who said, if violence is necessary, we're going to use it in order to achieve our freedom. Turner became frustrated with the treatment that Black people received in the South, and he encouraged Black people to return to Africa. He was actually one of the early folks that said that God is a Negro. And I know to us in 2026, that might not be, anything that's exciting or new, or especially people who live in a post-Black power America. But at this time, to say that God is a Negro, to say that God is a Black man, and there's no pictures that were being shown at this time of God being Black, for this man in the 1800s to say that was huge, right? And I'm sure he was probably instigated, not just by white folks, but I'm sure by a lot of Black folks, for saying that God is a Negro. So again, one of the early proponents of repatriation, one of the early proponents of Black folks going back to Africa, right? A lot of times when we think about this in our history, we know Marcus Garvey, right? Marcus Garvey, that's the African movement. But way before Marcus Garvey, there were folks like Henry McGill Turner who were saying, hey, when we get free out of here, we need to go back to where we came from.
Yeah, do you have any, given the history and context, I should say, of the AME Church, do you have any thoughts on what you think the AME Church should be doing now, in building kind of African strength internationally, or building diaspora coalitions?
I don't have any thoughts specific to the AME Church. I do have thoughts on the Black church in general. Right? I think all those things that you just said. I think I personally do think that the Black church should continue to do much more than it has. And as a Black church has a very strong history. There are some churches that do a lot for our people and are very forthright and strong in the fight and in the liberation of Black folks currently. And so there are some churches that are doing a great job. But I think especially those churches that have hundreds and thousands of members, churches that have a lot of money and a lot of resources and a lot of connections, I think could be doing much, much more. And I think that these mega churches that we have that preach prosperity, that preach, the church that Drewski picked on in his most recent, social media post that people got upset over, but it's real, right? The prosperity gospel, things of that nature. I think many of those churches could do a lot more. And so I don't have anything specific to say about AME, but I would love to see our churches go back to being a key social institution for our liberation.
And I asked that.
Hold on, because I see her hand.
You could always say that people stop always meeting.
Meeting and what? Meeting and eating. Black church good for getting some food together. Right. No, that's true. And we can eat and we can enjoy ourselves and have a barbecue and have a good time. But also, we need to continue to allow for the Black church to be one of those central. Because even today, it's still one of the most powerful institutions that we have.
Yeah.
It's still really, whether you agree with it or not, the Black church is still very, very powerful. And so I would love for the consciousness of the Black church to be raised, across the board.
I disagree with that a little bit.
Okay.
I disagree with that a little bit just because I think most of the power of the church went away whenever the United States decided to separate the church and the state was the church on laws.
Mm-hmm.
Once the laws were allowed to be made without, a presence of a God and the idea of a God, each judge can now just kind of interpret the law based on their own personal experiences or financial motivations or whatever motivations aren't God. Almost uniquely excluding God just to prove, that they put their hand on the Bible and said,
yeah. And that separation of church and state existed even during this time.
Yeah.
But it didn't stop them from, bring the gospel, but it didn't stop them from being able to utilize such a powerful institution. Right.
Right.
Mm-hmm. And again, when we think about how much of our conversation and much of our leadership, right? Even when we talk about leadership outside of the Black church, much of those leaders were trained, right? Many of them were trained inside of the ecumenical society, ecumenical communities, and many of them in Black churches, or even inside of the influence. So, still a very, very powerful institution. Yes.
And not to belabor the point, but I kind of asked that question about the AME Church as a denomination because they're responsible for at least 5 or 6 colleges in the United States. At least 5 of them are still functioning like a Worcester University. But the AME Church is literally in most African countries, including the Caribbean. In fact, even myself, I attended a service as far as Eswatini, it's now Swaziland. The AME Church is even in Swaziland, a tiny country in the middle of South Africa. So the AME Church, all Black churches, is global.
Yeah. And utilizing those denominations and those churches to not just build churches, but also build economic institutions, build our own banks, build our own manufacturing companies, have our own farms. Yes, grow our own food. And so I would love to see the AME church as well as other churches do that, for sure. Henry Highland Garnett, he's another person I wanted to talk about in terms of abolitionists, right? He pastored the Liberty Street Presbyterian Church in Troy and was active in the Underground Railroad in Rensselaer County. Garnett was led out of slavery in Maryland by his father in 1824, along with his 10 other family members. And Garnett started to gain national prominence when he delivered an address in the 1843 Black Convention in Buffalo, where his speech for Black freedom was generally perceived as a call for a slave revolt. So it was through, again, these men, it was through these religious leaders and many others that, again, we started to have this abolition movement, this movement for freedom. In the 1850s, Henry Highland Garnett, he helped to found this African Civilization Society, and it was an organization that encouraged Black missionary work and entrepreneurship in Africa. During the Civil War, he organized Black troops for the North, and afterwards became the first African American to preach a sermon in the House of Representatives in 1865. And the remainder of his life, he was appointed the president of Avon College. So again, talking about this push for abolition. This is a photograph of Henry P. Moore. Henry P. Moore was a photographer, and he took this photograph of this man by the name of General Thomas Drayton, and these were Africans that he enslaved. Right? So a picture of General Drayton, I believe, was here, and these were people that he enslaved. As we start to wind down, one of the things I want to talk about is the South's fear, right? As we get closer to the Civil War, these were some of the things that the South started to fear in terms of Black liberation, in terms of African people being free. They feared a loss of wealth because they understood that their wealth at its very core was built on Black bodies, was built on Black backs, not only built on the backs of Black people, but also built on the labor and built on the womb of Black women, right? Fear of loss of privilege, right? White folks in the South understood that there was a certain privilege, particularly an economic privilege that they had, because they were the ones that were creating the wealth for the rest of the country. There was a fear of the fall of grace. In the South, I mean, even now, there is this idea of what the South will rise again. The South will rise again. This is the time period they're talking about, right? Even to this day, some 200 some odd years later, the South still trying to rise again. The South still trying to come back to its time of wealth and time where they were so-called on top, right? The fear of the loss of position. Again, South will rise again. So these were the things that the South was fearing as they're coming to the end of the 1850s and this Civil War is on the horizon. They had this fear of loss of dominance and control, not only dominating African bodies, but also dominating the country. They understood that much of the country's wealth sat in the South. And they're saying, listen, we don't want to let this go. We understand that slavery is what's keeping us in this dominant position. We don't want to let this go because once the North can get this same thing from other countries, they're not going to need us. This is our only claim to fame, and we're going to hold on to this as long as we can. And then there was the fear of losing their dream and the ease of the antebellum South. Essentially, this was a way in which white folks at this time, particularly white men, led a very easy life, right? And actually, there was this book called Racist America. That talks about how many white folks in the North began to fight for the abolition of slavery, not really because they believed that black folks should be treated as human, or black folks should be treated as equal, but it was because it made white people lazy. It made white men lazy, right? It made them unskilled. And so now when it's time to fight against the Germans, right? If the French decide that they want to attack us, well, we're not gonna let no black folks fight. We're not gonna let enslaved men fight. Only people that can fight for us are white folks. But these folks have been sitting on their behinds for the past how many decades. They don't work, they haven't worked, they have no skills because they have African people to do the skills. And so when it's time to fight, they're not going to be prepared to fight for us because they're not strong enough. And so many of them said, it's making white men lazy, and that is the reason why we need to abolish slavery. And so that kind of goes back to what you were talking about in the North. There was, it's not just about getting rid of slavery, it's also about getting rid of anti-black ideas and anti-black traditions.
Food for thought, kind of put what you said another way. I'm a plantation owner. I'm making millions of dollars with free labor. Not only do I have free labor, whether I'm married or not, I got a free sex pool. And my wife can't complain about it. So I got the money, the labor, and the sex pool, and now the government's trying to tell me I gotta give this up. Yes, I'm gonna shoot you.
That's a good point, right? I mean, there was so much when we contextualized that there's so much that the South, particularly the white man in the South, did not want to give up when we're talking about abolition, when we're talking about getting rid of slavery. And so a couple of discussion questions that I had as we, kind of wrap up, that I thought might be good for us to kind of talk about was, one question is, how did the majority of enslaved black people support themselves? So even though we were enslaved, and even though many of us had to work for free, there were other ways in which we found ways to make money. In which I just told you about the one gentleman this was a black woman who hired a white woman, this was during slavery, hired a white woman to educate her son. How in the world did she get money to hire a white woman and she's enslaved, right? So how did black people support themselves during the slave process? Yes.
I mean, of course, they use a lot of their farming skills.
Okay.
And,
so you got farming skills.
Yeah, right? And like they started introducing trade. But I'll probably say we use a lot of interactions with the natives, you feel me, that we're at war. You feel me, to actually figure out how we can colonialize ourselves for their wars.
Absolutely, especially you're talking about in Florida. There was a lot of relationships we had with Native Americans where we learned how to farm, taught them many skills as well, and created these interracial communities within, as well as, again, creating our own farms, right? Taking our own land and farming. Any other ways that we support ourselves?
Trade, water, interaction between ourselves.
Yes.
Certain number among us have certain skills in certain areas. So we would sit down and make agreements. Do this for me, I'll give you make this or perform, or I'm on your children, depending on the situation.
Absolutely. We were not only farmers, blacksmiths, seamstresses, all kinds of cut hair, barbers. Barbering was a big thing. And some of our earliest millionaires, black millionaires, were barbers, right? Who began to use that trade to leverage buying homes, starting insurance companies, and eventually becoming some of the first black millionaires in America. So, yeah.
Now, I know it's on the question that you have enslaved.
That's throwing me off.
So, given that part of it, I would say in some parts, the slave badge program that the white people created. When I say the slave badge program, I'm talking about like in South Carolina, and like the famous book on that, all these trades you're talking about, the white people would categorize the African slaves that they had. Some would be considered fishermen, some would be considered like street hawkers, and some that were carpenters, they would say, and others mechanics. And the white people who were slave owners during the off seasons, they would have the slaves hired out to local white merchants in town, particularly in South Carolina, Charleston, Spartanburg, places like that. And so the Africans would work, and the white man would pay the African the amount that the slave owner had requested for their labor, but the Africans were allowed to keep a little bit of, sometimes keep a little bit of the money. And this is also how some Americans in the South were able to eventually buy their freedom from some masters who said, okay, you save enough money, you can buy your freedom.
Absolutely.
Denmark BC was the one who led the slave rebellion in South Carolina. The reason he was able to understand where the ships were in the middle of Charleston and other places is because he was one of those kind of people that had been hired out for his skills, and then he was able to kind of look around. But tragically, the whole thing was, though, if an African had a badge, managed to get a badge, they weren't. Like, for example, if an African was supposed to be a street hawker, that was of less weight in terms of the taxes that the slaves were paid. If an African managed to get a badge when he was in town, he said he was a mechanic, which would bring more money. So it was discovered if he did that, he would be severely whipped and flogged, and the slave owner would be at risk. And so about the owner in the town to actually hire them, because it's matter like the taxes. You pay more for a mechanic than you pay for the badge of the fisherman or the street hawker. So we get these ideas about taxes, about the litigation of how much people make and all that kind of stuff from systems that actually have been put in place and perfected in places like South Carolina.
I never heard of the slave badge system.
They were still, you know, it's called the slave badges of Charleston.
But yes, much of what was said, blacksmiths, carpenters, cooks, often we were hired out by so-called owners, or we just found other ways of making money, particularly on Sundays. So Sundays was many times our day where we could kind of have some level of autonomy, right? After hours, self-hire, enslaved people use their spare time to fish, hunt, garden, produce goods in these weekends, very hit markets sometimes that we would use to help buy and sell to each other. In coastal areas, like you were talking about in South Carolina, we worked on boats, piloted vessels, harvested shellfish, and again, performed tasks beyond the quota to help make money.
I looked up the slave badges on ChatGPT, and it does exist. He's very correct about that.
Yeah.
And it identifies the skills that they have.
The different skills, and then they would be hired out for those skills. Absolutely, yeah. What value did Black people place on education during slavery and why?
Pretty hard to see the killed the tribe.
Very high, very high value that we put on education, even to the point where we will risk our lives. Yes.
Well, I'd say high because that's the main thing that we were losing. You know, like we were losing education on our own communication methods. You feel me? We had to adopt, you know, whatever we thought was the lowest branch of education at that time. So, yeah, of course, we want to expand our minds more. Our bodies are probably pretty decent.
Absolutely. Anybody else?
It was also something that the system was always trying to deny.
Yes.
Slaves. So white people or whoever that tried to educate slaves, if caught, would suffer $600 fine, about $3,000 now, maybe 3 or 4 months in jail. So yeah, there was a high price on education.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Pretty much, it was like we hit the value that we had. It was a high value on it, but at the same time, you almost kill with having certain knowledge out there. You don't have a certain things. Or with a book,
Yes.
learning how to read things of that nature. You know, it's almost like risking your life to be educated. But it was how the value.
Absolutely.
We realize the value.
We risk our lives to be educated. We risk the lives of other people, of our children, to be educated. And one of the first things we did after emancipation, so-called emancipation, one of the first things we did, we started what? We started schools. And where did we start these schools? Going back to one of the earlier slides.
Churches.
We started in churches. Spelman College, right? Many of our HBCUs started in churches, right?
I'd like to just also add that education in the minds of black people, the slaves at that time, helped them to break the chain of indoctrination.
Yes.
Indoctrination was a very important thing, for slave masters at that time.
Yeah.
And education will break that chain. That's why it was so important for them to prevent that education.
Again, going back to the religious leaders, those religious leaders who were told to read or were giving Bible stories and biblical texts from their so-called like slave masters were only told to read certain books, but you have folks like Nat Turner who learned to read and said, wait, there's all these other books, there's all these other stories that support our freedom, right? And so again, once we place a high value on education, because the value in education literally meant, like you said, whether the expansion of our mind and the expansion of our mind meant our freedom, meant our understanding, our having this larger level of reconnaissance. And so, which again still exists today, when we are more educated, and not just educated about their history or about what they were understanding who we are, right? Educated about our own selves and our own history.
I see, so I'm from Gainesville, so there's a lot of former slaveholders that are now in charge of telling our collective history. So I see an active strategy of standardization because that obviously dismisses a lot of justice that has happened. And so I just want to see the value out of really telling the accurate history and having understanding so we can understand what we're actually.
I think that's a really good point because now what we're seeing is we're not seeing a ban on education now for any group of people, but we're starting to see a sanitization of that education. So now it's not, oh, we don't want to educate black folks, or we don't want to educate white students, right? We don't want to educate, but we only want to give them this kind of education. We want to tweak it. We don't want to talk about critical race theory. We don't want to talk about this aspect of our history. So we want to sanitize it so that we can make certain groups assimilate into American culture. And we want our white students, white young people to then say, oh, well, if they understand critical race theory, if they understand how this system has worked for all these different groups of people, it will make them be allies. And we don't want that either. So it's this sanitization of education for everybody. Right? And that's what we're starting to see now more than just a ban on education. Yes.
And even on a broader scale, when it comes to our education, there's a certain type of education that we receive in the U.S. Now, I'm speaking present day, but I mean, it applies to it as well. There's a certain type of education that we receive in the U.S. that is very boxed in, very, this is how it should be done. Yeah, I don't believe that was the same thing that we were learning and teaching each other back in the day.
Absolutely, yeah.
Well, I just have an interesting because they use a lot of words like documented, or because again, a lot of things weren't documented that were properly documented. So, like I just went to an event a couple weeks ago where it was a terror lynching exhibit. So they said, this family that actually likely would have been a participant in this is now holding a temporary exhibit where they said, there's 45 deaths in Alaska County that are documented in the 19th and 20th century, which is obviously.
Yeah, I understand. Yeah, right. Anybody else? Okay. Last discussion question. How did white people respond to black people's push for self-determination?
Genocide in multiple ways.
Absolutely. Attempted genocide, at the very least.
I would say intelligent rule changes, intelligent law changes.
Okay, talk
You know,
about that.
making the laws a little more up for interpretation.
Mm.
In fact, so I was going to say this a lot earlier when you were talking about how slavery in the South became a little more idealized than slavery in the North because they didn't want people to be more lazy.
Mm-hmm.
There's a strong economic component to that too.
Mm-hmm.
So somewhere between the Rothschilds and the Rockefellers, one group was financing, benefiting off the war. Another group was literally a bank that was providing the war for everybody, basically.
Yeah.
In Europe, they started paying the North to change their laws and rules and codes before the Civil War. You feel me?
Mm-hmm.
Now, they said this because Britain recognized that if we kept our slave labor, we kept just being able to produce, we would be more of a superpower than they are at the time. So it was more of a power move for them as to why they wanted us to start changing rules. The North said, you know what, we're not growing as many crops. The South is super out producing us at the moment, but if we can get them to agree, you feel me, we could probably, start loosening some of the tariffs that y'all doing. And, it'll actually benefit us too.
Mm-hmm.
So really it was Britain in the North against the South. You feel me?
Yeah. Extremely political. And what do they say? Politics makes for strange bedfellows. I think that's like the thing to say. And so, even in what you're arguing, right, that if this is going to be better for America as a whole, that we undercut the South in this transition into this kind of new economic wave that's happening, and we work with Great Britain and undercut the South, maybe that would be an unintentional cause or an unintentional consequence for the betterment of our whole country, betterment of as a whole. And that would also make for, I guess, would it create a need for slavery in the South as this transition is happening?
I'm about to say, spots like Virginia, they were pretty good on tobacco crops, but there were a lot of crops they couldn't grow.
Correct.
So it's just all like, all right, we have a cap on what we can actually import and export over here. So we need to do more trade with the South in order to even get our funds going.
Correct.
Meanwhile, the South could grow tobacco, cotton, oranges, grapes.
Which again, and they understood that, which led to the creation or led to the not the annexation, what is it? When the secession of the South from America. Very good. Just a couple of years for the timeline. Let's see how much we got. 14 more minutes. This is the timeline. Just go over some of these so we can see like the evolution of slavery and the evolution of these racist policies that you were talking about, policies that dealt with race and capital in this country. 1619 Maryland created a segregation policy that recommended that black people be socially excluded. 1642 was the Virginia Fugitive Law. Many of us know the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, but these slave laws have been in account for a long time. So there was a fugitive slave law that existed that authorized the branding of an R in the face of runaway enslaved people. So if you ran away and got caught, they put an R on your face to let people know this person is a problem. Virginia marriage law prescribed banishment for any white woman wanting to marry a black man. The Virginia anti-assembly law impeded black people from meeting or having a sense of community, which led to the so-called slave codes, which then led to the black codes of the Reconstruction era. A couple other things. First, naturalization law. This is quite interesting, actually, seeing as though naturalization is a hot topic now, right? But Congress declares the United States a white nation, right? A lot of people don't know that. In 1790, considered to be a white nation. 1793, free black people, or Virginia migration law forbade free black people from entering the state. Going to 1819, Missouri literacy law forbade assembly or teaching black people to read or write. And then even coming down here to Florida, 1827, restricted voting to only white people. 1846, South Carolina observing law forbade black and white people from looking out the same window. Couldn't even look out the same window. These were the types of laws that were created to do their best to help keep black people as second-class citizens. Okay? So every southern city and town had slave markets where enslaved people were bought and sold. African person, young African person, may be worth about $12,000 in today's money. I think I read somewhere that said if you want to think about the economy in terms of buying and selling of African people, think about your average person, right? Your average person, average household has about how many cars? Two to three cars, maybe? 2 to 3 cars. So your average middle class person at that time may have purchased about 2 to 3 enslaved people, right? Now you have very rich people have about how many cars? They might have 10, 11, 12, which is a lot of cars. Yeah, exactly. Same thing, right? Poor people may not have any or may have one, right? Poor, working class, or whatever, depending again on where you live, or and again, this is just very generalized. I'm not saying if you only have one car and you're poor. But again, it's kind of generalized idea around how to think about how many people certain people had in terms of enslaved people. So again, about $12,000 in today's money is what a strong young enslaved person would be. The value of an enslaved person depended on their age, their skills, and this became important because again, around 1808 was when it became illegal to bring African people from Africa into the Americas as enslaved people. They had no rights, and an enslaved person could be whipped for crimes like even looking at a white person, talking back to a white person, or running away. They would be tortured, imprisoned, or worse. Some so-called masters were seen as less cruel or kind as opposed to others, and not all so-called slave masters ruled by the whip, but most of them did. And many of them would do psychological, because the physical whipping or the physical damage was a lot less worse than much of the psychological and emotional damage that would be done to African people when they would be threatened to send their children off to another plantation, or threatened to sell their wife or family member to another plantation. Much of that can sometimes even be worse than some of the physical damage that was done to us. Enslaved people could not leave their master's land without a written pass. They could not visit the homes of other white or free black people. In most other states, it was against the law for enslaved people, in some, to go to church, or for a so-called master to teach a so-called slave to read or write. And many owners felt that education and religion would help give African people the idea to wish for their freedom. Some states had laws saying that enslaved people could not marry, but most enslaved people could marry, and they stayed together in their families. And then there were ways in which, instead of depending on the government or depending on policy to tell us when we could get married, many of us would have our own marital ceremonies. And what is something that we would do in our marital ceremonies to signify that we were now a family? Jump the broom. We jumped the broom, right? So these were things that we would do to say, we're not going to let the government or let America or let the white man tell me that I can marry this woman and have a child. When we jump this broom together, then we are a family, right? And so that was, again, much of the way in which we resisted this slave system. Most so-called masters recognized that the breaking up of the family was cruel, but this did not stop them from selling certain members of the family away. On the cotton and tobacco plantations of the South, There were these crops that were grown. All the work was done by enslaved people. Some of the largest plantations had hundreds of enslaved people that worked there. White farmers might own just one or two of them, while the great majority of the white Southerners actually did not own enslaved people at all, right? Because they just couldn't afford it. So again, talking about how class played a role in enslavement. An enslaved person with skills, carpenters, mechanics, etc., they were able to use this money to purchase their freedom, or they were hired out by their masters to make money for the master, so-called master, to make money for themselves, and they would use this money as leverage for their own freedom. In the cities of the South, enslaved people had a better life than on the plantation. Some men worked in factories or on the railroads. They worked in construction, trade, carpentry, bricklaying, etc. And in some ways, enslaved people in the cities had as much freedom as free black people. So many African people would oftentimes, even instead of running north, they would run to some of the big cities in the South, like Memphis or Atlanta or New Orleans, where they found themselves having more freedom and more opportunities. Some even lived apart from their so-called slave masters, but they still did, make them free. So these are just some of the conclusions and some of the summary of what we talked about in terms of life as an enslaved person. The last thing I want to talk about when we talk about slavery is the notion of reparations, right? What are reparations? When we talk about reparations, what are we talking about? Repair, okay? Anything else? What are reparations?
When a group of people has been done wrong by another group of people, and to make up for what has been done, the other group of people helps that person, that group, get back on their feet, get back to a level with humanity.
Absolutely. Yep. So your answer.
I was going to say healing is kind of the way I think of it. I want to say it was Malcolm X said pulling the knife 3 inches out of my back is not taking the knife out of my back.
Absolutely.
That's
Absolutely. Yes. A certain amount of dollars for your suffrage. Absolutely. Is reparations. So we talked about reparations financially. You talked about reparations emotionally, right? Healing. Yes.
Yeah, I look at it a lot as a part of our economy because, like, just how even as a capitalist country created such an imbalance from the get-go. So, a lot of that wealth still exists, through the companies that directly benefit.
Absolutely. It's not even just reparations for that particular event. It's the effects that event continues, right? The continued privilege and the continued subjugation from that event, right? So that wealth disparity still exists today, right? And much of it is because of the wealth that was created during the slave system. And what are some reasons for Black people saying that they should receive reparations?
Because other groups have received it and we haven't.
Absolutely. Many groups, and not even just in America, right? Worldwide. The people that own, they got reparations. Once they got, once enslaved people were freed, and then they were giving the money back for the labor the cost that they lost for the loss of slavery. And not the actual people that were moving on to the labor. Right? So it's crazy.
At minimum, for the positive contributions that Black Americans put towards the country.
Absolutely.
The roles and whatnot.
Absolutely. The positive contributions in the ways in which out of this system we have created expanded American culture. Yes.
Also, another thing, we were like the 40 acres and a mule, that was something that was promised to us, and a lot of us never received that.
Yes. A majority of formerly enslaved people did not receive the 40 acres and a mule they were promised. Right? Ta-Nehisi Coates has an article.
Japanese Americans that were put in internment camps or concentration camps, they were given reparations. Back either before or just after the Civil War, European immigrants that would come here, they would have the, I'm gonna call it land grab for lack of a better term. You've probably seen it in movies where they line everybody up with the buckboard and say go, and whatever land you can get to and mark off, that's your property, free of charge. They wouldn't allow Negroes to do that.
And there were all kinds of land real acts, and Dr. King even talks about many of these acts that were given to a GI Bill and these subsidies that were created for many white farmers and uneducated and unskilled white folks to help subsidize their wealth building process, and none of that was ever given back to blacks in mass, right?
Yeah, being in real estate, like I still see, I can draw the red lines today because again, things have kind of evolved.
Right. Oh, absolutely, absolutely. Real quick, I just want to talk about Queen Mother Moore. I think Ta-Nehisi Coates' case for reparations, if you've ever read it, Google it. It's really long. Wrote it, it's probably about 10 years ago now. But I think it makes a really good point. He makes a good point for the case of reparations post-slavery. So he's like, you know what, I'm not going to even deal with slavery. I'm going to deal with housing segregation and show just how much money America has made and just how much money has been funneled out of the black community just off of housing segregation, right? Which makes a great case for reparations. Queen Mother Moore, friend of Marcus Garvey, she was last seen as the Million Man March, was one of the women who have been, I would argue, an unsung hero of the fight for reparations for black folks here in America. Her grandfather was lynched in Louisiana. She was the founder of the Republic of North Africa, and when she was alive, was fighting for reparations from 1950 until her death in 1997. And so Queen Mother Moore is one of many folks who have been fighting for the fight for reparations for black folks for a very long time. Yes.
I had just two comments. One is out of place in terms of the time frame when you talk about now, but that I just want to remember about Thomas Jefferson again. It's one of the kind of slaves, right? And so the notes on the state of Virginia book, he wrote that Native Americans or Indians, he said, were people that were white people who wore moccasins. And he said that they were a more primitive state of white people in the 18th century. That black people were permanently savage, but Native American people were not. So he said they were like the white man who wore moccasins. He said, so let the blood of the colonists mingle with them, because they were these kinds of people that could be elevated to at least some level of European in the future.
Yeah.
But I also wanted to point out, when you mentioned about the land grabs of white people in the U.S., one of the famous schools, right, in the U.S., Oklahoma Sooner, about the Sooner wagons, right? Sooner wagons, wagons where the white people went to the Oklahoma area to take land, but they went out sooner that the cavalry could protect them from attacks from the Native Americans. So anytime you saw the wagons coming, these white wagons, these were called the Sooner wagons, so they weren't supposed to go there that quickly. They came too soon before the cavalry protected them. So all throughout this country, every bit of it, every inch of it, is based upon white supremacy, even down to even the flag of Hawaii today has a British flag in the left corner. Flag of Hawaii. Everything is based on white supremacy in this country. And I think that this needs to be stated over and over, just so our people know what the truth is. Maybe the MAGA movement will finally convince us the truth should not have forgotten.
That's a good point. Yes.
I don't know if we're going to get to it here or not, but what would reparations look like today? Would that be a financial handout?
That's a good question. That's actually a good question. I was gonna talk a little bit about post-traumatic slave syndrome. I think we might could end there, right? With that, because we're already out of time. But we probably end with, what would reparations look like today is just kind of a discussion question as we close out.
Shoot, I think the BIA, like, there's a similar model with the indigenous people.
If you kind of get to the picture.
So they have sovereignty and they have an organization. I think a lot of resources need to go to research. Because again, like what I mentioned before about the kind of response of like there's not a lot of documentation of a lot of what happened. And that's intentional, whether it was destroyed or not. Because again, you have the oppressors in charge of telling the history now. Obviously, if they want to sanitize it and under exaggerate the trauma. So I think the sovereignty and resources to research and figure out again if that was done, so we can start preparing.
Right. And there's been quite a few bills that have supported that, putting money towards the research for reparations. Anybody else want to ask that question?
That's a multiple value answer. How would it look like today?
Yeah.
Everybody, a lot of value studies on, but it was needed. We need something different to just about every person that would fall under the requirements of the scheme.
Sure. That's true. Because, that is true. Because different people, different groups, which groups, how long, so some people make that argument as well, right?
There's a discussion of should it just be a cash payment for like people of African lineage or anything like that, or should it go into systemic change and like community programs or schools or for housing and like pollution management of communities.
And then some people may argue, do you have that and then subtract all of the money that has been given to schools and that has been given to certain organizations? Is that included in the reparations? You know what I mean? All kinds of, so there's, different people have different thoughts. And you have thoughts?
I think 75% of the reparations that are needed are going to have to be self-prepared. If Black people do for ourselves, knowing that whatever people think we might get and money from the government or whatever probably isn't coming. And 75% of the repair, we try to repair our minds of what had been taken from by slavery and the after effects. Maybe if we prepared ourselves, maybe we wouldn't really need much from the government in terms of physical reparations, whether we had it or not. Even though we're old, and yes, whatever was given might help, but you don't have the mind to use it. It's like food with money, soon will be parted.
Yeah. I think that speaks to your slide there, post-traumatic slave syndrome, and how it's just in our DNA. And it needs to be discussed and fleshed out so that we can heal from what we think is not bothering us, but really is.
What is bothering? What is bothering?
Exactly what's on the board. We were traumatized as a race or nation of people, multi-generationally. We have been oppressed. And so our minds and our spirits have not healed. And if you ask any one of us what's bothering us, we can't really identify it. You know what I'm saying? Because we're so out of touch with who we are, what happened to us. We don't even want to think about it. You know what I'm saying?
Who are we?
I know what you want to say. I know what you want to say.
I know who I am. Okay? I know who I am.
That's right.
There, the layers that we have to go through for what's called reparations kind of takes us through what I was studying as political ideology. And you have capitalism, you have socialism. Technically, we're under a level of imperialism right now too. So the capitalistic aspect, there is a financial bargain to it, but there's a historical financial bargain to it. Like, not only do we need to know who to not give reparations to and who to give reparations to, but those people multiplied. You feel me? Those people multiplied and then crossbreeded. So now it's like you get half reparations. Like that's more about a global perspective. That's actually more in imperialism. But the second side of imperialism is who's going to trade with us? You feel me? Like who can we send out ships to with our own products, and do trade with? You feel me? We can't do that right now. There's a level of socialism in there too. Like our face value card outside of the United States isn't, it's not what it's supposed to be. It's not accurate. You feel me? It's not healthy either. And then you got the internal issues. You feel me? Like there's an emotional language that we can speak amongst each other. That's not scholarly. It's not something that we can go on a global campaign and say we've been through this. You feel me? It's almost something we put into our music, and if they understand our music enough, they start to see how their life, they start to have their own way. So it's like we almost have to deprogram the art to bring out the emotional pain of what we're actually going through.
Yeah.
And then find policies that you feel me align with, that align with the actual truth, that aren't just so open that anybody can interpret it however they want to. So it's about fourfold.
Was that your hand? Because I saw a hand over here, but I was like, wait, I think you moved.
And that both of their points are exactly why I asked that question, because I don't feel like you gave me, I don't know, 25,000, like, I might not be better for the community. I'm going to give you 25,000, right?
Yeah.
That's kind of my point, is like, on a real deal, on a deep scale, emotional, mental, like, how do we, not financial, but how as a people do we return that? How do we heal? Yeah, that's why I say reparations heal. How do we heal mentally, physically, and then the financial shit will come.
Real quick, if you would, I think reparations and post-traumatic slave syndrome should be a presentation all its own. That's a lot to unpack.
Yeah, it is.
We can't get all that in today. You got to make that.
All right, go ahead.
I agree with him about how Native Americans have their own sovereignty here. Like with the Republic of New Africa, how they wanted land in the Black Belt for Black people. I agree with that. Because like he mentioned, if you give me $25,000, that doesn't matter if you're still oppressing me. So even that, I mean, if you're still oppressing me, I don't have my freedom. If you were to give us, if we can govern ourselves, I think that'll help a lot of it.
Yeah, absolutely.
I just want to say too, last time we spoke, I talked about running the book club.
Yes.
I don't know if we got any progress on that, but I would love to do a book club, and I love that book. I hate it, but I love it. Just heads up, y'all want to do that.
Yeah, that was one of the things I remember you was talking about was out of this class just having like a separate book club where people could join, and if you want, we could maybe get a sign-in sheet or something going, like a separate book club if people are interested, maybe on the back of the sign-in sheet. If that's something you might be interested in, and I can send it to you, and you can kind of organize that. But yeah, that was something we was talking about. This as we're going through different articles and books and things of that nature to do further study, because that's what it's all about. You can't get through everything in just these 2 hours twice a month. You know what I mean? So this is just to get the conversation started. This is just to educate our people, educate our community, and do what the government and states and policies are trying to take away, real history for everybody. We're trying to bring it here. So I think that's a great thing. So if you're interested in that, let's sign up for a book club and let's get that going. With that being said, I want to go ahead and end it. I want to respect your time. The next meeting, again, I talked about, we're going to have 100 years of Black History celebration on the third Saturday of this month. So make sure y'all come back. And, you know, we're going to try to, we're going to do something really nice to celebrate 100 years of Black history this year. Again, please sign the sign-in sheet. If you're interested in book club boards, just sign in. If you're not getting the emails, it'll be a reminder of the class and what we're doing here at Ashe Institute. Just a couple of books if you want to take, and a couple of references for information that we talked about here. If you want to take a picture of that, you can. And thank you all for being here. Thank you.
But you don't just want to add bigger productions. You want something that will bring the
Thank you.